the FBI arrested me.
Is that right?
Yeah. I spent 2 nights in a federal prison cell. I was arraigned.
Who's working for Pfizer and talking about...
Jordan Tristan Walker was his name. I'm kind of terrified. This guy then assaults my cameraman.
Don't let anybody hold you back.
Amen.
Just do it.
Presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy.
Vivek Ramaswamy, a Republican running for president.
We should not be apologetic to stand up and speak for the truth. Let's talk truth.
Man, I've been looking forward to meeting in person for a long time.
Great to be with you.
James O'Keefe. You know, the slogan of my campaign is truth. And you're a guy who I know has gone to great lengths to get to the truth on some things that people didn't really want the public knowing the truth about. Is that a fair description of you?
Yeah, I think that's a fair description of the role of a truth seeker, which is to expose things that people do not want published.
So tell me about your journey a little bit. I'm familiar with what I read, but you know what? Sometimes it's best to get it from the original source. What led you up to the point of founding Project Veritas? I mean, that takes quite motivation to do. What's the backstory of how you got to that point?
And I think we're the similar age. You're 38, I'm 39 or so.
Yeah.
And not to ask you the question, but weren't you some type of in Harvard? Weren't you like a artistic, or you rapped, or you did some
I mean, I did all
poetry?
kinds of stuff. Yeah, I did spoken word.
We have that a little bit in common. I was a thespian in high school, so for me it was like a desire to show people things in an artistic way and perform and produce this material so people could wake up. But it was 9/11 was my senior year. September 11th in high school, and I remember just reading the paper every day, reading the New York Times every day in college, and that really brought out something in me. I wanted to. I thought that the news was not being honest. That they were coloring information, they were packaging information. I felt differently than it should be, so I became a columnist at my Rutgers paper called the Targum when I was 18, and then they removed me as columnist. I wrote a column that they didn't like, so I started a little newspaper called the Centurion when I was 19 years old.
What was it about? Do you remember?
The column at the Targum was about the ratio of voting Democrats to Republicans amongst the professor staff. It was like 104 to 1 was the ratio.
Factual reporting
FEC
on that.
data. And I wrote this column, I think it was called like the Conservative Manifesto or something like that. And I wasn't really even that right-wing or conservative. I just felt there was an imbalance, and I needed to change it to become more balanced.
Yeah, and they didn't like that.
Apparently not. And
so they told you to leave, or
they didn't renew the column. So I had this column. They didn't renew it. Although if I did a hidden camera behind the scenes, maybe they would tell the truth about why they removed it.
Okay.
So
but anyway, so you went and you did your own thing.
I did my own thing. Started my own little newspaper with $500, and we produced a sort of monthly newspaper magazine called the Centurion.
Cool. And that you did that through your college years?
I did that until I was senior year in college, and it was some of the best years of my life. I went to Rutgers, sprawling like Ohio State, although it's not called New Jersey State. Yeah. It's the only state university just called Rutgers, and I had a little staff, and I grew it into kind of a local muckraking newspaper where we were looking into things, and doing gonzo journalism.
And then what happened after that? Path from there to Project Veritas.
Senior year, I was 21. I graduated, and I worked for a nonprofit. We're going around the country helping them with their student newspapers. I did that for a year. Then I went to law school, dropped out. Then I went to business school and dropped out. And then I did a story on ACORN when I was 24. And that became a national sensation. It was Andrew Breitbart picked it up.
Right.
Oh, in the interim, I did do some stories on Planned Parenthood with a girl named Lila Rose.
But you got to know Andrew Breitbart, I think,
very well
personally, right? Not a lot of people today, remember him as a person. I never met him. I've heard a lot about him. What was your relationship with him like, and what did you take away from that guy?
First of all, that guy was a force of nature. He knew everyone. I can't tell you how many people I meet who say, I was his best friend. So maybe that's so, but we did speak every day. He was a force of nature. I met him September 2009. He died March 1st, 2012. When he died, I thought it was a joke. I got a call from the Daily Caller. It's like, Andrew Breitbart's dead. I thought it was a practical joke. He was only 42 years old.
He was a young guy, yeah.
42, 43 years old. He was so enmeshed in the media ecosystem. Like in 2011, it was a different world.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we're Manichaean. We're so polarized that like the Washington Post thinks of me as the other. But back in the day, someone like Dave Weigel, we'd actually tweet back and forth. So Andrew lived in that twilight of reality where you still could be friends with reporters but also hold them accountable. And what he taught me, he was an editor of the Drudge Report. In fact, when I went to his house, he was actually editing Drudge Report. It was wild to see. He had the HTML up on his screen. He was just a guy who knew how to play the media and how to choreograph the media and get covered by the media. That's really, and he was a force of nature. He tweeted hundreds of times a day while running his company. I don't know how he did it.
And he was quite an intellectual, it seemed to me, as well.
Yes. He was a great writer. He went to Tulane.
Yeah.
Clarence Thomas was the thing that really inspired him. And him and I were very different people. So I was more introverted. He was more extroverted.
And he picked up some of what you put out. That story about ACORN was probably the big one, huh?
Yeah. I knocked on his door. I went down to his basement. I opened up my laptop and I showed him the video of this Baltimore ACORN woman telling me how to disguise this illicit prostitution money. I'm undercover as a pimp, and I'm telling this lady, hey, I've got all these underage girls, and this ACORN official's like, oh, don't put that on the tax forms or disguise this on your tax forms.
And what is, I mean, I've heard of it. I know this, predecessor group to a lot of the groups today, but like what is ACORN? What was it? Yeah.
ACORN was the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now. And they helped with housing and loan opportunities for low-income people. They also did voter registration drives, so they got out the vote. It was founded by a guy named Wade Rathke in Arkansas, and there were allegations that they were embezzling money and doing improper things. So we did a sting to try to see if ACORN would go along with an illicit, immoral, illegal thing. And they did, and it was wildly entertaining. The camera was in a tie, and it was a wire going. I sell them on my website. A button camera goes into your pocket, a little SD chip. So I get all these videos, and I show the first to Andrew, and I said, and there's another one, and I show him the one in New York where they tell me to disguise the money in a tin can and to get away from the pimp. And then I show the one in D.C. where the ACORN official says, we're not going to tell the police this, and Andrew says, I've seen enough. And then he takes a step back, and his whole complexion changes, and he goes, this is going to embarrass the mainstream media like you can never believe. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, because we're going to put out the first tape and say nothing, and they're going to call it an isolated incident. And then we're going to put out the second tape, catching CNN and the New York Times in their lies.
Calling it an isolated incident.
And lo and behold, just a month later, we did this, and after all was said and done, the New York Times printed an apology. This is extraordinary.
That is good. You don't see that anymore.
Clark Hoyt, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, published a column saying, we were too slow to tune in, and admitted that they should have covered the story. In fact, Congress voted defund ACORN before the New York Times even assigned a reporter on the story.
Wow.
It was Democrats voted to defund ACORN. 80
So they were getting public funding.
Yeah,
from taxpayers.
They were going to get billions.
Unbelievable.
They were going to get billions. They were receiving, I think, $100 million in public money.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, so this was just two kids from the cast of High School Musical 3 with the video camera and the grandmother's chinchilla coat. So it was an indictment on everything.
So then you started taking this approach to...
Well, everyone before that thought I was crazy and stupid, and I had shared this vision with people, and they thought I was nuts. And then everyone thought this is the best thing ever. Right?
Yeah.
Suddenly everyone believed in it. And then I was arrested just a few months later for being in a senator's office. I was asking Mary Landrieu, then Senator Mary Landrieu, some questions, her staff some questions, and they realized who I was, and they sort of charged me with a crime I didn't commit.
Oh, really? What was the crime?
Tampering with phones. So I was there to ask about the phones, and this is in
what phones?
The phones belonging to then U.S. Senator Mary Landrieu, because this was during the so-called Louisiana Purchase with the Obamacare. So apparently Landrieu was a moderate Democrat, and she voted for Obamacare in exchange for some goodies.
Okay.
So the constituents were lighting up her phones, and sources were telling me that she had disconnected her phone so that the constituents could not reach her. So I thought it would be funny if me and a bunch of guys went in there dressed as telephone repairmen saying, hey, Do you need help fixing your phones? Oh, clearly we're not there to do anything. We were just making a funny YouTube video. The FBI arrested me.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was. I wrote a whole book about it. It's kind of funny that 15 years later, no one remembers this. And it's at the time, this was like I thought it was
like a big
the
deal.
End of my life. I spent 2 nights in a federal prison cell. I was arraigned, and then they gave me a misdemeanor for entry by false pretenses.
I see.
For a journalist, even though there was no false pretense, I showed my driver's license, but I pled guilty to a misdemeanor and spent 3 years on federal probation.
How was that?
I couldn't travel without permission from a probation officer and a judge, and I thought it wasn't going to be as bad as
3 years of
was. That. 3 years. Well, 3.5 years if you include pretrial release.
And so were you able to continue your journalism during those 3 years?
Well, that's a very interesting question.
Because it's under federal surveillance. It's kind of an interesting form of journalism.
I thought probation was just don't break the law.
Yeah.
But I'm an enemy of the state. So my probation, they would come up to my house, and we did a story in New Hampshire, actually in January of 2012, and I couldn't go, to New Hampshire. The probation officer told me strangely, and I think the probation officer was a fan of mine. This guy named Pat Hattersley out of
He's
Patterson,
doing his job. Yeah.
Patterson, New Jersey, which is not the best place to be. He goes, listen, you can do your work, but it has to be in New Jersey. I'm like, what? Mm-hmm. That's a violation of the first. I mean, it's just so like Stalinist.
Yeah.
But nobody cared. Nobody supported me. There was no money at the time. I was my office was in this sort of carriage house, makeshift, sort of halfway carriage house sort of structure. And I kept going, and my little team went around this country, and we and that's how Veritas began. Veritas was started while I was on probation.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So I know what it's like to have nothing. I know what it's like to have no money. I know what it's like to have everyone think that you're a failure and you'll never succeed. So there's been these sort of ups and downs in my life, and all that really matters is you keep putting out stories.
Yeah, that's your motivation.
Yes.
It's clearly not making money. I mean, you're not running a business on this stuff.
No.
And it's interesting. You have this whole conservative media ecosystem. There's, for some people in this podcasting world, it's proven to be a profitable line of business.
Well, they tend to project their own biases and motivations onto you, because if they're all about money, they're going to say that you're all about money, because that's what they're all about. For me, it was like, I was thinking back to those days in the carriage house, like, okay, I have nothing, but in order to get this laptop, I have to get the money. So I have to go ask them, oh, now I need an attorney because they're suing me. And I realized you're
like in your 20s now? We're talking like early 30s?
I was 25.
25.
So one donor became 10, became 200, became 1,000.
And what are the profile of these donors, and like what kind of money are they putting up?
It's interesting. First of all, I paraphrase Howard Rourke from The Fountainhead.
Yep.
I don't do things in order to get donors. I get the donors in order to do things.
Yes.
And I do things the way that I want to do them. So if a donor isn't...
You should teach that to the politicians, actually. That'd be pretty nice.
I don't know if there's any saving those people.
Yeah.
But in order to... I would never let a donor tell me what to do. So if a donor tries to do that, I'm like, I'm walking out. Mm-hmm. And the donors, eventually the people that wanted to support me did. In the very beginning, it was very few people. I mean, I think it was maybe a handful of people, and then the first year, 2011, I think we maybe raised $200,000, which covered a few salaries and whatnot. And then the next year it was $600,000, and the next year it was $1 million, and the following year it was $2 million. It was almost linear progression, 50% each year. But it was never about that. It was about, I need to do as much as I can in the limited amount of time that I can do it. And time was always, I know that you're a busy man. Your schedule's insane. So for you, it's about maximizing time.
Sure is, yep.
And getting as much investigative journalism. Investigative journalism is hard.
Oh, yeah. You never know what you're going to find, something that's interesting.
And sometimes you get nothing. So you
totally.
might spend $1 million and get nothing.
I know that feeling. I mean, it actually was one of the things I was going to ask you about is it reminds me weirdly of my first career, where you would never draw this analogy, but was actually drug hunting, right? Developing medicines. You never know in advance which one's actually going to be the one that works, which means for every one that works, you need, there's like a whole footprint of like multiples more behind it that nobody ever sees. And I've got to imagine that's what your life was actually like. And all of them require courage. You're taking risks. And my line of work is more capital risk, but you're taking deep personal risk, which is even significant.
There was, in the beginning, there was one thing we did in New Hampshire where the Attorney General, or I don't remember, it was the Associate Attorney General, I think he raided or came to the home of the reporter who did the story, and his name was this is a relief. You can't make this stuff up. The Attorney General's name was Richard W. Head, aka Dickhead. This is New Hampshire, and he sent this guy with photos and sort of terrorizing the family. And you have to remember this. You have to remember how surreal the circumstances are.
He's terrorizing the family of
the mother and the sisters of the journalist who did that story, who resides
who
in
is
New
part of
Hampshire,
your group,
working for me, part of my group.
And what story was he doing exactly?
This was a story involving we had gone to the poll locations of people who were dead, deceased voters, and say, hey, do you have Susan Jones there, who's a deceased voter? And the poll worker goes, oh, here you go. Here's Susan. Here's your ballot. They were giving out the ballots. And it was all on video.
Okay.
And this was like a lightning rod issue.
And was this, and not that it matters, but this guy could either easily be a Republican or Democrat. But I'm just curious if this is a
videographer.
No. The
both.
They
were giving out Republican ballots and Democrat ballots. The Attorney General was a Democrat.
Okay, got it.
Richard Head is his name.
Yeah.
So you have to understand, the circumstances are, I'm on federal probation. I've got virtually no money. No lawyer wants to work for me because they all want $600 an hour at the time. Now it's $1,200 an hour. And you're living on a prayer. You have no safety net, right? It's all risk, and that's been my life basically since I started. Even to this day, even the Pfizer story, when I confronted that guy, the cops came, the NYPD came, and
that was the recent one, right?
That was the one in February.
Yeah,
where I confront this guy, and it's me. We don't.
This is like the guy who's working for Pfizer and talking about
Jordan Tristan Walker was his name, and he was the mRNA scientific planning guy. And like Chris Hansen or Mike Wallace, I usually confront these people with the footage. And what happened was he called the NYPD. Now we probably should. We don't cloud the footage while we're recording, so.
That's a good idea.
I'm coming from a context where people destroy my recordings and then falsely accuse me of crimes. So I'm kind of terrified.
Yeah.
This guy then assaults my cameraman.
He starts going nuts.
Have you seen this video?
Yeah, I did see this.
He's on the floor. He's grabbing the ankles. I mean, these are the leaders that decide public policy in this country, on the floor, assaulting. And I'm backing up because I've seen this rodeo. Yeah. In Louisiana, they destroyed my SD chips. So I'm like, we have to get this ST chip out of here.
Yep.
So you're always on the frontier. You're always just one step away from the abyss. And you took risks in the capital markets. I take risks.
Much more personal risk you're taking. Yeah.
In a different way. Yeah.
And so that was the one that ultimately then got you booted from your own organization that you founded. Is that nominally what happened?
The timing is a matter of fact. So the timing, people don't like it when I say this. I don't know. I mean, it's just factually the case that we broke that story on January 27th, I believe, give or take a day. Of this year,
right? Yeah.
Of this year. And there was a board meeting on February 6th, and I was removed on February 10th. So the timing was at least really stupid
on their part. Yeah.
And that's what people were so outraged by. It's like, why would they do that?
Yeah.
I was responsible for raising about $25 million a year. We had a bare bones development team. My expense account was $200,000. I had to travel around in an SUV, because I'm on the phone with sources and I'm on the phone with donors, and you have to protect those people's identities. So it was really bizarre, the timing. And I'm not so sure that there is that someone was bribed or something like that. I don't know that. I don't have any evidence, but I know that one board member liked to say, we don't need James O'Keefe anymore in this organization. That it's like,
I don't think they've done too well without you. It doesn't seem so far.
Well, when I left, they had about $8 million cash on hand or so, or $10 million cash on hand, and they spent all of it in the last 6 months.
Interesting.
And I was running around the country raising money to make sure all these people got paid.
Yeah.
And it was almost an impossibility. You're the face of the company. You're running around. I mean, you run around the country. I think you have a private plane, though.
Yeah, it makes it easier.
I'm on jet flights until midnight. I'm dizzy from the lack of sleep. But I think the Pfizer story, it was a big deal. It was it was probably the biggest story that we
I remember
broke.
that. Yeah.
It was it affected people.
And the funny thing is that story exploded in part because only a small handful of people who had reach in conventional media actually picked it up. Right? I mean, like I saw it on Tucker. Tucker was all over it. He did a phenomenal job.
Piece. That was amazing.
He did a phenomenal job. One of the things I love about him is he doesn't view himself as competitive with other journalists doing good work. He actually gives them a chance to elevate what they do.
We'll dive into the story in a minute, but it wasn't so much that I have evidence or information that someone paid someone off. It was that the story was such a big deal.
Yes.
And it elevated Veritas and my name to heights never seen before. That there was a board member who said, "This is our opportunity to get rid of James O'Keefe."
I mean, what is going on in that person's brain?
I'm not a psychologist,
right? But I mean,
I think you
even
should
just
ask that person
just
that
a
question.
basic business judgment or organizational judgment to say that, okay, we usually want to double down on success, not to take the legs out from under it.
Well, 7
It's
years
amazing.
ago,
the same thing happens in corporate America, by the way, all the time.
I've heard that.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating.
It was like I think the
Where are these people? I just don't get them.
I got calls from people saying this guy is telling us that James O'Keefe had nothing to do with the success of the story. And one of my board members, had me over his house in Connecticut, and I said, "Where are you getting that from?" And he goes, "Well, that's what this guy told me." I'm like, "So if this guy told you to jump off a bridge, you do that?"
Yeah.
And he's
maybe he would.
And I said, "This is me in the video. What do you mean I have nothing to do with the story?" He's like, "Well, you're not the one who recorded it." And I'm like, "But
you're the leader of the organization."
But I'm the leader. I'm taking all the risks. I'm being raided by the feds. I'm being sued personally. I have to raise $20 million to pay all these people.
Yeah.
It was the logic was so.
This is the thing that kind of frustrates me at times, even in the conservative movement, is stuff doesn't get off the ground that much because of all of the BS of the infighting and whatever, where, people on the left have mastered their capture of universities, corporate America, Hollywood, and otherwise, and they're always this bright-eyed conservative vision that'll start on day one, and very few things are able to actually get the traction to hit critical velocity because of stupid stuff like this. It'll be some sort of animus of a battle between personalities, and I think part of it, I don't know if this is true in your situation, but part of it is that when your actual principal motivation is to make money, right? There's pros and cons to that, right? But a lot of people in the ESG movement or otherwise, their motive is to make money. And they're using the smoke screen of caring about some sort of social agenda and cause as just like woke smoke to deflect from the fact that, look, at the end of the day, we're in this to make an extra buck. And I'm going to be disciplined because that's the metric that matters. Whereas what I see in a lot of the so-called alt economy, and I know yours was nonprofit, but it's a similar mentality, is they'll tell themselves that their motivation was actually that they're business people and they want to make money, but actually their motivation was actually self-regard,
Yeah,
I guess.
The way to put it. Self-regard.
And so, I mean, you're saying this guy wasn't a donor or something like this to you, and it's not like money was his motivation.
I'm sure he's watching this right now, and he'll
but
tweet
it's like
about
self-esteem.
it. And I
I don't even know who this guy is, so I could care. I mean, it's not a personal thing; it's a system.
Talk about it because what I've found in my life. I've been called a fraud for 20 years. This is not new. I've been through worse than this, and defamation that makes you question your own sense of reality. Gaslighting, jail, raids, lawsuits. So this is not. I'm not new, but I just.
It almost doesn't matter who the individual is.
But I am going to talk about it because I think you're right. I think it's the issue at hand that it was that 7 years ago or so, a board member who got off the board, great guy, still talk to him. He's an advisor of mine. I won't say his name because these people have a freedom of association right under the First Amendment to associate freely with a nonprofit without being doxxed. But this guy gave $500,000 to Veritas, and he pulled me aside.
It's a lot of money for
It's
a
a lot of
nonprofit.
money.
Yep.
It was a lot of money. We had a few people that gave that much. We had half of our budget came from $100 donors, $50 donors. This guy pulled me aside and said, "You've got to get this guy off your board." I said, "Why?"
Oh, he said this
other
guy who
person.
gave you $500,000, the guy who's actually writing the check,
Yes.
says the guy who's not writing the check, you might want to watch out for him.
I said, "Why?" He said, "Because he's envious of you." He said, "Because he wants to be you, and ultimately he'll work to replace you. And nobody can be you. Nobody can be you. We're all our own person.
That's right.
And I found that there was some of that, and I don't look at the world that way. I guess I've never been much of a jealous person. When I look at my heroes or people like that inspires me.
Yeah.
I remember seeing like Little Shop of Horrors in high school. I saw Seymour. I'm like, that's amazing. I want to be in a musical. It's not. So there was that, and it was inconceivable to me when that guy told me that. It was so outside my experience that I did nothing with the information. And in other words, I didn't take the warning seriously. And then when the Pfizer story broke, it was like, here's our chance to get rid of O'Keefe. And it was so painful. I went through so much pain the first week. I don't think I ate any food. I think we've all been there in life once or twice. But I realized as soon as it happened, no use crying over spilled milk. Bizarrely, I had more DMs and more people reaching out to me. Debbie Bernal was this Pfizer whistleblower who provided some of the documents inside Pfizer that corroborated Jordan Walker. She was previously unwilling to go public, and then after what happened, she was inspired to go public. So it strangely helped me journalistically, and that more people kind of trusted me after when you go through these sorts of trials and tribulations.
That's pretty interesting. Now, the only problem is you don't have the infrastructure to capture all of the inbound.
You build again.
So you build it again. So how you've been funding that?
How by funding the rebuild? Well, it's OMG.
More donors, I suppose.
OMG is not a nonprofit.
OMG is the new thing.
Yeah, we do not have a board.
Just a company.
I question the efficacy of these sorts of boards.
Yeah, I seriously question the efficacy of these sorts of boards.
When I interview you, I'm going to ask you about that because I want to hear your take. But
sure.
It seems to me there was a piece by Dr. Robert Malone who wrote a great piece about this called "The Institutional Pathology That Removed James O'Keefe," and it's all about sort of churches and hospitals and boards who don't necessarily own the company, and they question when you are successful. They seem to go back and question the success. They take a backward-looking focus. Why do we take all these risks in the first place? I could have done this differently, and it's like, are you nuts?
Yeah.
Like, why don't you go out and do it? Why don't you go out and build it? It's hard. It's very hard to build things.
Oh, it is.
It's very easy to destroy things.
It's very easy to sit on a board. It's a very passive verb for
you're
a
right
reason.
about that.
Sit. Okay.
And I hired this Goldman Sachs guy who is part of the so-called managerial class who you speak about.
Oh, yeah.
No offense to investment bankers, but I'm probably never going to hire an investment banker again as a manager. And I learned a lot. And I think that what I take from this experience is that I think it's a blessing because I made some mistakes. I put some people on my board I should not have.
Okay.
And I learned from this.
You own that. Accountability.
I own it.
Yep.
I learn
like
it.
that.
And next time I hope to not make that mistake.
So the new thing's set up more as a company.
Yeah, it's a company, and people
I think
support.
it's better.
Yeah, we have subscriptions. We sell the cameras now. We don't just
good.
give them away.
Yeah.
And there's 4 cameras that we use. We sell them. We sell a class, which I'm going to do a shameless plug for the O'Keefe Master Class. There's 5 hour-long master classes on journalism, and we're charging for them. We've already sold 1,000 of them.
Good for you.
And if we sell 4,000, we break even on the air.
Oh, good. That seems doable.
And then
given that you just got started.
Yes. And we put out the stories, and we were putting out a lot of school board stories right now, and eventually hope to monetize that.
Well, I mean, that's just the mechanics. That's not your passion is what you want to do. You've got now the plumbing
can't save
for
the
how you
world
set it up.
unless you can pay the rent. To
Yeah,
your
of course.
point.
You've got to be practical.
But my passion is always the story. Like the only thing that keeps me going is, oh man, I got to expose that guy.
I can see that in you, and you know, I mean, that's the Howard Rourke in you. I mean, for him, it was designing buildings. For you, it's designing and telling the story.
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's a different motivation. But you're not looking for unsolicited advice, but friendly reaction is, I think you need someone who can do the plumbing for you so you're not focused on it. I think that there's, in the early stages, I wouldn't necessarily say that's necessary on day one. You kind of want to have the architecture set up. But the only thing is, when I see a rare talent is an understatement, but a rare soul like you who has a calling. I don't know if you're religious. Are you religious? Yeah. Okay. I mean, God puts you here for a reason. That's my view. And so pursue the purpose for which God put you here, not something else that takes away even an iota of time from that. But it's a hard thing to do because get that wrong and you ruin the whole thing, right? And so it's a hard thing. I've been there. It's a tough balance. And there's an element, I will say this on a positive side, this is probably the stage you're in now, where in the early phase of building the plumbing, I've made this mistake in other settings before, is you fall into the trap of thinking that like, okay, there's the plumbing and there's the substance, right? You're bringing the fluid and somebody else needs to build the piping. In the early stages of getting any new thing off the ground, those two are actually inextricably linked.
That's right.
But then there comes a point in time when you have to say that, okay, the fluid is different from the piping.
Well said.
And I think that you're probably not there yet in this journey because this is so recent.
My mind, this is so on point, and you're the only person who's actually said it in the way that you have. So thank you.
I've lived it,
and I'd like to ask you about that. But like my mind goes right to like, for example, managing lawyers.
Yeah,
I get sued so much, and in your book you write about LLCs and liability. Like I'm named personally.
Right.
In investigations that I had nothing to do with. I'm only the leader of the company, and they sued me. They didn't even sue the reporter.
Unbelievable.
They sued me. So now I'm still having to indemnify myself. But the point I'm thinking about as you went there is I'm like, I realized early on in my life that if I want to do the right thing, I have to be the chief decision maker. I have to be the ultimate decision maker.
Yeah.
I think Steve Jobs said something like that. Like I have to be the person in charge. Not because I want power. It's because
that's what it takes in a certain way.
In order for me to do my art,
Yeah.
I can't settle that lawsuit. I can't bear false witness. And if I work for somebody else, the system will make me bear false witness.
Right.
It'll make me compromise on my ethics. And if I compromise on my ethics, to borrow the Howard Rourke metaphor, then I have to destroy the building because it's not the building that I want to build.
Which he did.
So, which he did.
Yeah.
He blew it up. So that's the tough part.
Yeah.
In my deal. And I think there are certain people that wanted me to be the gopher. Oh, you just go raise that $30 million and you just do your art. Well, it doesn't work that way. You can't give me all of the responsibility, but none of the authority.
Mm-hmm.
I have to have the authority in order to...
Separation of responsibility and authority is a funny thing.
Yes.
Actually.
And I'm still learning that. Maybe you can give me some pointers.
I'll give you my 2 cents. It's not the same for every person, but I'm just making an observation of what I see in you. I think the number one question for you is, you know why God put you here. You know what your purpose is, what your calling and your passion is. First of all, let's just pause on that for a second. That's a beautiful thing to know. And you're young. We're similar age category, but most people our age, most people any age are lucky to ever figure that out for themselves. You figured that out at a much younger age, right? Like over a decade ago. So you already got a head start. Let's start on the really positive side here. I mean, what a head start to have at a relatively young age in your 20s already to know this is your calling. This is what real self-realization looks like. Well, boy, is that a head start. Now everything we're going to talk about is like easy by comparison, right? Like that's the hard question. Who am I? I mean, that's a hard freaking question to get to the answer to. I think most people never get there over the course of their entire life, let alone over the course of middle age. You're there at a young age. So like, let's just put things in context here. Notwithstanding all the trial and tribulation you've been through, and I'm saying this, you don't need my pep talk, but I'm saying this for the people who are watching to see, right? Because there's a version of looking at your story that can leave, there's part of me that feels this way, sad, to see what a guy like you has gone through and what our country does. Censor, silent, jail, arrest, kick out of organization. It's the same managerial class doing the same thing in different ways. There's a sad version of that story, but let's not do that one. Let's do that.
Right.
Let's do the version where this is a talent that was put on this earth to do this thing that needs to be done, uncover things, stories that weren't told, and just tell them literally without a filter, with like directly just by putting up the footage that he gathered directly and allow you to see it. That's a cool place to be. Now it's just the implementation question, right? And so I could give you my 2 cents on the implementation and how to think about that, but at least for me as an observer, I don't know for you, but it takes the pressure off to see that you've got like 7/10 of it already under your belt.
That's a good point. That's an astute observation. I definitely know the why. I've got the why down.
You definitely know the why.
And some people are not driven by that and motivated by that, and
or don't know it even,
or don't even understand. Like you say, in the political world, which I'm very curious to ask you about this when I interview you. But it's just like people are projecting onto you all of their demons.
Exactly.
So you really have to be confident in your constitution, and you have to know who you, and you can't trust anybody. That's the other thing. In the journalism business, you have to trust. You have to open your heart to people to get them to trust you. But
trust is a two-way relationship.
It is. But what I've also learned is, wow, like it's hard to trust anybody. And everyone always asks me, how do you, James O'Keefe, they say, aren't you worried someone's going to infiltrate you? And I would always say, no, I'm not worried, because there's nothing that I'm doing. Yeah, but that's not how they see the world.
Yeah, it's
because they got a million things to hide. They got skeletons in their closet up the wazoo. Or in a more demonic way, they'll falsely accuse you of things. So let's say there is no camera recording your encounter. They'll just make something up about you.
Yeah.
Which is why I always told my staff, please do record me.
Right.
Because the recording, I want the recording versus the
artificial telling.
Yes.
The artificial telling is far worse than the recording. See, it's interesting you say that. Embarrassment is a choice, actually. I think that's kind of one of the many lessons that I learned from watching your professional journey. Mm-hmm. One of the morals that I take away from that story is that what happens, happens. Mm-hmm. What's true is true. How you feel about it is a choice, right? And so I think that people view you as somebody who embarrasses other people by showing things they've done behind closed doors that they wouldn't do in public. But even that Pfizer guy or whoever it was, the act of being embarrassed and humiliated, like that's a choice by what you said, own it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that what you're calling out is an element of our human nature that's fundamentally fallen, insecure, to say that there are things that I'm willing to do that I don't want to acknowledge that I'm willing to do, or things I'm willing to say that I don't want to acknowledge that I'm willing to say. And that gap, that doesn't fall on you. It doesn't fall on the camera. It falls within each of us as a human being. And I think because you're in the position you're in, you've realized that, hey, tape everything you do, and that's the way you would live your life.
Something to the effect of democracy, health of a democracy is determined whether people can say the quiet part out loud. Or
yes, just speak, say in public what you will say in private.
Yeah.
And we would be so much more united as a country, by the way, if everybody did that.
Right.
But the reason you'd be more united as a country, and I loved your earlier use of the word constitution, right? You referred to your personal constitution. Mm-hmm. But there's an analogy to a nation that's insecure at a similar level, too. You got to know who you are. Then you don't need to apologize for it at the individual level, at the level of a nation. But today, the reason, why we're as divided as we are, I think, is because people don't feel free to say in public what they'll otherwise say in private. And that's a loss of self-confidence that we need to somehow rediscover. I guess I got a question for you is, this is a hard question. Mm-hmm. So I mean it in a challenging way. I'm not sure what my bias is on this. Do you think in the mode you've chosen to do this, right? I have no doubt you're doing a useful service you've done a useful service for the country, opening people like my eyes who've seen the things you've exposed. I can speak to that personally, that you're doing a value for the external world. But for that person, or for the person who's on the receiving end of it, do you think you're making it more or less likely for them to live the rest of their life afterwards in the direction that you strive to live your own life?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that guy from Pfizer is more likely to be even more embarrassed the next time that thing happens? Or do you think that having gone through this experience, he's now at the level of an individual on the other side of that? I don't know if you have a view on that.
That's an interesting question. That question seems to cut to the very heart of what the First Amendment stands for. I go back to the because I think you mean like hidden camera exposing someone who's behind closed doors.
Yeah.
He wasn't behind closed doors. He's in a public restaurant, but nevertheless, he doesn't know that he's being recorded. So what?
Yeah.
But that really speaks to, I mean, before hidden cameras, there was pencil and paper. Like Upton Sinclair, when he infiltrated the jungle, he didn't record it, but he, 60 Minutes producer Don Hewitt quips, are we going to get upset at Upton Sinclair for smuggling his pencil in?
Yeah.
So there were written accounts, submersion journalism, newspaper journalism, muckraking of 100 years ago. But the camera is more telling, isn't it? It picks up on things that the pencil does not, right? It picks up on it almost damages someone's dignity.
More
dignity. People feel violated because their dignity. But this is the paradigm that we're entering. And as Scott McNeely once famously said, you've lost your expectation of privacy a long time ago. So it really cuts to the heart of the First Amendment and why it exists, to inform the people. People have this is a cliche, but a right to know certain things. And I don't think I would use these cameras in certain places. For example, I've never gone into someone's bedroom. I've redacted very private things about things that we've recorded.
Out of respect for the subject.
Yeah. Like there was a story on NPR we did where an NPR official brought up the name of a Libyan reporter in their newsroom, and I redacted that. And then people attacked me for doctoring footage. It's like, I can't win.
Yeah.
But
no, but it's a judgment that you make, right?
It's a judgment, and that's the most that's the most important part of being a journalist.
It's the judgment.
It's the discernment and the ethics. Journalism, people follow people. I've always said content is king, which means if the story is big enough. But what I learned recently, I learned this in the last year, is actually content isn't king. People follow people. People trust people. And a lot of people trust me. Because of what I've been through. I thought the jail and the defamation and the harassment.
That feels closer to the flame to me, yeah, because you do hear this content is king thing. It always kind of lands flat with me.
Yeah,
I think you're right.
The Viacom founder once said that, but I said that because in the beginning of my trajectory, I mean, and the reason I'm saying this to you, you might say, well, let's focus on the positive, but I think it's important to focus on the suffering a little bit.
Also, because that's both part of the truth.
Because because it makes an ordinary man question his sense of reality. When you're Wikipedia, and I know your Wikipedia page, all the Wikipedia pages are pretty nasty, but like, it is so bad. It is like he doctors tapes. He's a felon. I'm not a felony. Yeah. Like he rapes women. I mean, just like he hates black people. I remember reading that as a 25-year-old. I mean, nothing prepared.
That's not me. It's unrecognizable.
It's almost like combat.
Yeah.
Like it's PTSD.
Oh, but it's literally like combat. I mean, I can tell you even in a political campaign or whatever.
Yeah.
Like people, I mean, much less derisive, but just to the level of inaccuracy, stuff will show up saying that I was born in India, has the wrong last name of my wife. I mean, it's just people who can just, edit and say anything. That's fine. The answer to, I don't think that we should have a systematic suppression engine of that. But what it does do to the level of a person, I think, is interesting, and it sounds like it's worn on you a little bit.
And I bring that up because I think that is why it is so important to use hidden cameras in certain contexts. And I write in my book, American Muckraker, it's a question of relative deception. We have a Washington Post, to borrow an example, who did a front page story in 2009 when the ACORN story came out, and they said James O'Keefe went after ACORN because he doesn't like black people that vote. She just made it up.
It's like the headline.
She won the Pulitzer Prize, and then she had to print a front-page retraction because I never said that. Can you imagine if I did that or you did that?
No
we
chance.
Would rightfully be crucified. So when you live in a world where that happens on a daily, and by the way, that's just the stuff that I called out, happens 100 times a day, and they get away with it. When you live in that world, it's not just morally permissible to record people without them knowing. It's a necessity. And that's the world that we have to live in. Now, what effect that has if you want to live in a different country or a different world, which does not place a primary emphasis on the First Amendment, then go live in that country.
Yeah, they exist. Most countries are that way.
Most of them are that way. I think our Article 3 courts still, generally speaking, protect the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm still here and not in
Thank
prison.
God. Yep.
Thank God. Although, who knows what will happen, and I think over the next 5 years we'll find out.
That's part of why I'm in this game. We're going to keep it that way.
And the Article 3 courts generally protect the First Amendment because the same journalists that want to point a gun on me, like when the FBI raided us, they were like, whoa,
Yep.
They're like, whoa, we don't want to be raided by the. It's self-preservation.
That's
the
right.
ACLU is defending or filing amicus in my case because the FBI raided me and they never released the probable cause. And the law stipulates that if you want to raid journalists and point guns at them and take their notes, society needs to see what the probable cause is.
Absolutely.
So that currently sits on a federal judge's desk, and she has to rule on it.
I think she'll come. I mean, most federal judges, I think, we're still at a place where they will come out on the right side of this, and if not, the Supreme Court will.
Right.
The current Supreme Court understands this.
It's sad that we have.
But that's the last
put it,
bastion, and
it's sad that we have to say who's the judge or who appointed the judge.
Yeah,
that's everything.
But it is where we are. It
Yeah.
is where we are now. So what is your view on our way out, or do you have one?
So I was an extreme. I am an optimist. I was an extreme optimist for the last 14 years, almost to the point where everyone else would be a doomsayer to me, and they would say, you know, the country's done, it's over, and I would always be, no, there's hope. What happened to me at Veritas was extremely disheartening, and if you're not careful, you can get twisted pretty fast. Because it's one thing, you're taking arrows from the front. Like imagine you're in a battlefield, to borrow an old metaphor, and you're getting arrows thrown at you and swords thrown at you. But imagine the people behind you start shooting arrows in your back. It's dizzy. You can get twisted.
Yeah.
So I think you have to surround yourself with strong people, discerning people, good people. You have to be very careful if you're going to do this work, who you have on your team. But I am an optimist. I think miracles can happen, tides can turn, and I think that what I've seen in the work that we've done, I'm a bias towards the work that I'm doing. Most recently in New Jersey this past week, we did a few stories on school boards. Every mother in every municipality is contacting me and wants me to go to her school and give a hidden camera. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. I think that's a hopeful thing.
It is.
And I think more people than would admit agree with someone like you and what you're saying, but they're afraid to say it.
Yes.
So the majority so it's like the Soviet Union. Like, are we going to just cow down in our homes and be afraid to say the truth and lie to our children so that we can survive at any price? Or are we going to be brave? And being brave means sacrifice. It means, the founders said, lives, fortune, sacred honor to each other. More people agree with us than don't. They're just afraid to admit it. And that still keeps me as an optimist and keeps me as a hopeful person. And I think the tide can turn if people know what's going on, if they know what's happening at the IRS and the FBI, if people could see what's happening inside schools, inside government bureaus, and how they talk about you, the taxpayer. If they could see that for themselves, it would change people's whole perceptions, and it would save the country, I think.
I think so, too. And I think the reason it would save the country is that 80% of people or more in this country would have the same reaction, which is not what we're taught to believe, right? You know, we're taught to believe we live in a divided partisan time and, you know, somebody, 50% of the country is going to agree with one thing and 50% another. I don't see it that way. Not on the kinds of questions that you're putting your finger on the pulse of, which is just straight up corruption, lying, dishonesty. I mean, I don't know whether you're Democrat or Republican or left wing or right wing or what you thought in the Iraq War or high taxes or low taxes, but you want to know the truth about what Pfizer is or isn't saying about the vaccine. You want to know the truth about what your media is or is not telling you about an organization that's getting boatloads of federal funding in the name of promoting civil rights in the form of the ACORN example. And so I think that when it comes to the basic values, right, free speech, honesty in government, self-governance as opposed to elite aristocracy, most Americans agree on the basic rules of the road. They might be divided on abortion or whether corporate tax rates should be high or low. And, those are questions that people might want to debate vigorously, but that's not the kind of thing you're putting your finger on the pulse of.
I think it'd be difficult for you to find my political views anywhere on the internet. I don't never espouse.
I'm not sure I know what they are.
I don't espouse a public. I believe in reality.
Yeah,
but
you're allowed to have political beliefs, but
do
it's
we
irrelevant
even agree
to it.
on that? In other words,
right now we don't.
Are you entitled to
that's
more
what's
than one
on the
truth?
table.
Because that's my belief. I
That's
believe
what's
that
on the
2
table.
plus 2 equals 4,
or
2
plus 2 equals 4 is racist.
And
those
this
are
is
the
a
questions.
microphone, and this is a cup of coffee. I'm not actually sure that as Americans we can agree on that. So that's my baseline.
Well, here's what I would say. Here's my view on this, because I do have a strong view on this. Maybe you'll disagree with me on this. This comes from traveling the country, not through the filters that were fed through cameras and social media algorithms and otherwise, but that is what I'm doing right now, is traveling the country with roomfuls of people, from tents in Wisconsin to, farmers in Iowa to, people in New Hampshire or whatever it is. I believe that most people in this country, like the overwhelming majority, easily over 80% of this country, can agree on those things. That is a mug of coffee.
80%?
At least 80% can agree on those things.
Relatively low, but
no, it
start
is
somewhere.
It is, but I'm just telling you what I see. I mean, it's sad that it's only 80, but it's not 50%, right? As we're taught to believe. It's easily over 80%, and half of the 20 are people younger than you and I who never learned the tools of discernment in the first place, right? You and I were both in latter half of high school when those two planes hit the Twin Towers. When I gave the commencement address at my high school 2 years ago, that was the first year where not a single one of those kids was born on the date that those two planes hit the Twin Towers. And so I think half the people never really learned what those values, most importantly, the tools of discernment to get to truth, were in the first place, who we can bring along to agree with us, not on corporate tax rates being high or low, but that's a cup of coffee, right? For lack of a better description, just grounded on certain things that are true in the world, agreeing that what your camera captured
think that is?
Really happened.
What went down? What went wrong?
Well, I think that this gets into a deeper discussion. I think that we as human beings, especially young people, need to be grounded by something, because we need to be able to believe in something bigger than ourselves. I believe this, at least. I think we need to be able to believe in something bigger than ourselves to see what is true in front of us.
I see.
And so there's a role played by faith. There's a role played by family or hard work. Patriotism, I think, can play a role here too. You don't need all those things, but you need like one of them. I would say faith, family, hard work, patriotism, pick two. And then you have enough grounding in your sense of self to say that, okay, I am me and I can recognize that to be true. But when those things all go missing, then you're lost, right? You're a vacuum. You have a vacuum in your heart. Then you're going to just believe, you're going to believe anything because you have a vacuum and something's going to fill the void. If it's not the true thing, it'll be the fake thing. And so that's a much longer discussion. But to bring back to where we are right now as a country, I share some elements of your pessimism, but I do think that 80+%, and it could be half the remaining 20 coming along with us too after we fill that void and bring them along, generally people younger than you and I don't think that we're actually as divided on the basic questions of truth as we're taught to believe. And the way we call the bluff on that is by, frankly, people like you, man, doing what you're doing, right? Let people react to it and close that gap between what people are willing to say in public and what they're willing to say in private. That calls the bluff on a division that I think is mostly manufactured.
There was a recent, just real quick, there's a recent example last week of a story we did. It wasn't an undercover journalist. It was a police officer at body camera footage. And these school board officials called the police on citizens and myself. And I did a FOIA request. I got the body camera footage, and the cop was talking to the superintendent, and you could see the psychology of these people and what they actually believed. That woke. I encourage your audience to watch that. That was not a big story; it's a municipal story, but it was fascinating because one of the superintendents goes, "Let's scan the license plates." It was like a little mini tyrant in action, and the superintendent was like, "They're citizens, and they've come from all over the place, and they're here. Where's the cops?" It was like a sketch comedy of what these people are actually like behind closed doors. And I think more things like that, revealing real human nature, because human nature is pretty nasty. So we need to expose it and understand the truth. And then I have an infinite faith in the power of the American people. They can, if they elect you or whoever else they want to elect, and Congress can, we have all these people in Congress who are supposed to make decisions, but people don't have access to the information. So that's my job.
I think there's a version of what you're doing that gives me some inspiration and ideas for how to do this in the federal government as well. I mean, we're talking about taking on the deep state. Okay, what is that? The managerial class, the administrative state, right? The people who were never elected to be in a policymaking function, that are functionally in a policymaking function, even though we say they're not. I think exposition is a big part of the key to success. It's at least the first step, right? I mean, I think one of the things that Musk did at Twitter that I thought was pretty good, simple first step, is just publish the files of what the government actors pressured this one private company to do. I think there's a version of this for what I'll call the state action files. I want to do this pretty early on, is just anytime a government official in the federal government has pressured a private party or a private actor to do something that the government couldn't do directly, I think there are all kinds of ways in which that's illegal and we need to deliver accountability. But let's just start with step one. Just publish it. Mm-hmm. Let's just see it. You got to roll the log over, see what crawls out. There's an element to this that I think is harder in certain settings than others. Well, actually, maybe you've seen a version of this too, literally. I think the way it works in the federal government, this is what I think happened to Trump a little bit, is you roll that log over, you see what crawls out, you strike the swamp strikes back. So I think if you're going to roll the log over, you got to be ready and willing to bring the pesticide. I think that's the equivalent of quite literally the guy coming and beating up you and your staff, trying to like break your car.
They'll try to put you in jail.
Yeah, that's what they'll do.
Does that scare you?
You know, I think that at times the idea of apparatus this deep taking it on can be daunting, but less so over time, because no question is like, what's the alternative? Right? One of the things I think about is, let's just try the alternative like a set of clothes. Let's roll that forward. 20 years from now, that's the generation our kids are going to grow up in anyway, right? Not unique to my kids, all of our kids. And so I guess it's like the instinct of, I don't know, like I say this as somebody who's a parent of two sons. God forbid there's a moment where there's like a car about to crash into your child. You're going to put your body in there and just get in the way. Not because you know it isn't going to hurt them, but it's still your best chance of ensuring it.
You're doing it to protect your family, whereas it's counterintuitive because most people don't do it so that they could not be away from their family, or you're doing it to protect your family. It's sort of
familial instinct. It's not unique to my family, obviously, but if you think about our relationship to one another, like our relationship to our family members, like that's the impulse for me is, are we taking some risk by going on the path that we're going on? Like a lot of risk? Absolutely. But we're doing it at a time where the alternative,
there may not be a country in 10 years.
Is really exactly
your children. That's my talking point. When I meet with people and they're like, our talking point, it's what I've come to say when people, but aren't you worried about your children? It's like, well, I'm talking about their children. And I say, well, if you want to care about your children, you have to be involved.
Yeah. I mean, what's your alternative?
What world will your 6-year-old live in 10 years from now?
Yeah. I think that's where we are. I think that's where we are right now. And so that makes the choice a lot easier. I think it's also why you see sometimes positive change doesn't happen gradually. I think negative decline often happens gradually, actually. It's infinitesimally small pieces of a downward slide. You don't see ascent happen in the same way. It's you get to the depths of where you're at the precipice, and then that just selects for either ultimate decline, and then it's all gone and you're done, and history, relegated what was once good to the dustbin of history, or it selects for a quantum leap of just saying, okay, we're not going to gradually find our way out of this, but we will leap our way out of this. And I think that's one of the moments we're in. And you're one of the people who's lighting the match. And the question is, do you combust a good kind of reaction where you cause a rocket ship to take off, or doesn't it? In which case we're all done, and that's the ball game.
My team and I force people into these boxes where they're required to make a decision. Like when I've been in court, in federal court, and the jury verdict, it forces all this hyperbole and innuendo melts away. And it's like, do you want to live in a world where you, and I've been in court many times and I've won, all but one, where there's logic prevailed. You force people into make this decision. There was a case in North Carolina where logic prevailed. The federal judge is like, I've watched the video, ma'am. There's no edit. She's like, but where's the edit, ma'am?
Yeah.
And she's like, okay, case dismissed.
Yeah.
I force people into that, as you say. You get down, and a miracle can happen. You can turn the tide. But you got to get people there
That's
where
right.
they're confronting the reality, and there's no BS.
That's
and
right.
The media is filled with BS. That's why I use cameras, because and I don't think the artificial intelligence is there quite yet. I saw the Indiana Jones movie with Harrison Ford, and I couldn't pay attention.
It's not.
It looks like it looks
just not. I'd rather not watch it. Yeah.
I mean, is this what AI is supposed to be like? His face looks mangled. We're not there yet to create the paradigms and circumstances that my reporting does with police body cam footage and superintendents and people are calling. So I don't think AI is a threat to me yet. But we force people into that moment you just described, where they're required to grapple with the questions.
Yes.
And there is only one truth. And when I say truth, I heard a joke recently, and truth is beauty is truth, talent is truth, art is truth. So like this Lizzo, this woman, obese woman on the front of magazine, she's so beautiful. There's a joke. If you want to upset your girlfriend, tell her she looks like Lizzo today. There's a truth in each and every one of us. And there's only one truth.
Yeah.
So we're trying to wake people up. We're trying to shake people awake. And I'm confident that we will do that. If the First Amendment is under attack in this country.
It is.
In a serious way. We still have it.
It is.
The FBI still has.
But not for long unless we do something about it.
The FBI still has my devices. For 3 years ago. It's one of the greatest violations of the First Amendment in the history of the United States for them to raid journalists' homes over a story I never even did.
Unbelievable.
So shameless plug there. Not shameless because I have to pay the legal bills of my
No, it's
journalists.
not shameless at all.
But Private Citizen is the 501c3. It's tax deductible. It helps fund our citizens' legal bills. Private Citizen 501c3 if you want to support our First Amendment rights there.
Well, James, I appreciate what you do. I think you set an example for young people who, I think the most important moral of the story isn't any of the implications for the country, all of which is important, but for maybe a younger person watching this, at least being somebody who found his calling, who's pursuing it, who's doing it without apology, a modern-day Howard Rourke in his discipline. And I mean that as high praise.
Thank you.
And I hope you take it that way.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate you being here, man. Keep at it.